They looked me right in the eye and told the armed guard I was not on the list. My own brother laughed, adjusting his pristine white uniform, and told the officer I was just a spectator who belonged in the cheap bleachers. My parents walked right past my car like I did not even exist. They thought they were putting me in my place at the biggest military ceremony of his life. But they had no idea that in exactly 45 minutes, the highest-ranking officer in the fleet would bypass my brother, completely turn to where I stood in the shadows, snap a perfect salute, and announce to thousands of people that they had been waiting for my orders. My name is Clara. I am 34 years old, and I am about to tell you how I dismantled my toxic family on a federal military base. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who constantly underestimated your worth and tried to erase your accomplishments. The morning sun was already baking the asphalt as I pulled my unassuming dark gray SUV up to the main security checkpoint of Naval Station Norfolk. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of salt from the nearby ocean. It was a massive facility, a sprawling complex of gray steel razor wire and the heavy, undeniable presence of the United States Navy. I rolled down my window, the cool air conditioning of my car spilling out into the Virginia heat, and handed my civilian identification to the stern-faced military police officer standing guard at the gate. He took it without a word, scanning the plastic card. His expression was completely unreadable behind his dark aviator sunglasses as he looked down at his heavy clipboard. "I am here for the officer commissioning ceremony," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and polite. "I should be on the VIP family access list. The last name is the same as the candidate being commissioned today." The officer ran his thick-gloved finger down the laminated sheet of paper. He checked the first page, flipped to the second, and then checked the first page again before handing my identification back with a crisp, dismissive shake of his head. "I am sorry, Mom," he said, his tone devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "You are not on the VIP access roster. I can give you a temporary visitor pass for the general admission bleachers, but you absolutely cannot drive this vehicle into the reserved family parking lot. You will have to turn around and park in the civilian overflow lot a mile down the road." I stared at his mirrored sunglasses for a fraction of a second, the reality of the situation clicking into place. This was not a clerical error. The military does not make clerical errors regarding VIP access lists for major ceremonies. My family was meticulous about optics event planning, and most importantly, control. Being left off the VIP list was a deliberate, calculated move to humiliate me. It was their way of reminding me of my place in the family hierarchy. The invisible, disappointing daughter who had refused to play their corporate games and therefore deserved no respect. Before I could even put the car in park to figure out my next move, a familiar, grating voice cut through the idle hum of my engine. "Is there a problem here, officer?" I turned my head to see my brother Jason strolling out from the pedestrian walkway of the visitor center. He was 30 years old and practically glowing in his heavily starched dress, white uniform. The golden buttons caught the sunlight, and he walked with the exaggerated, puffed-up swagger of someone who firmly believed the entire world revolved around him. Today was supposed to be his crowning achievement, the day he officially became a commissioned officer in the Navy, and he wanted to make sure everyone knew it. The military police officer immediately stiffened, recognizing the gleaming uniform. "No problem at all, sir," the guard replied respectfully. "This civilian is claiming she is supposed to be on your family VIP list, but her name is nowhere to be found on the cleared roster." I looked directly at Jason. He looked back at me, a slow, condescending smirk spreading across his perfectly shaved face. He stepped closer, leaning down slightly and resting his hands on the windowsill of my car, deliberately invading my personal space. "Oh, her," Jason said, with a loud, theatrical laugh that was meant to be heard by the surrounding guards and passing pedestrians. "No officer there is no mistake here. She is definitely not on the VIP list. She is just a spectator. Jason tapped his knuckles against my car door, treating me like a stranger who had lost her way. You see, Clara, the VIP section is strictly for the people who actually supported my military career. People who understand duty prestige and what it takes to succeed. Not someone who sits behind a desk doing basic computer work all day in civilian clothes. You can take the general admission pass and go sit in the hot bleachers with the rest of the regular civilians. If you manage to get a good spot and squint hard enough, you might be able to see me get my rank pinned on. Before I could even formulate a response to his arrogance, the heavy thud of expensive leather shoes announced the arrival of my parents. Richard and Patricia materialized behind Jason, looking like they had just stepped out of a corporate catalog for wealthy defense contractors. My mother was wearing a tailored designer suit that easily cost more than my first car. She adjusted her heavy diamond necklace, her eyes scanning my outfit with blatant, unapologetic disgust. "Are you seriously wearing that coat to a military installation?" Patricia scoffed, her voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointment she had perfected over 3 decades. "We are sitting with senators, admirals, and top-tier Pentagon officials today. Our manufacturing company is sponsoring half the naval technology on this base. And my own daughter shows up looking like she bought her wardrobe from a discount rack at a suburban thrift store. It is completely humiliating for us." I glanced down at my dark trench coat. It was completely unbranded, impeccably clean, and custom-tailored to fit perfectly over my dress whites. But to them, anything without a flashy designer logo was instantly categorized as trash. They had no idea the coat was standard issue for a flag officer in transit, designed specifically to hide the heavy gold rank on my shoulders until I was safely inside the secure briefing rooms. My father stepped forward, placing a heavy, proud hand on Jason's shoulder. He did not even bother to say hello to me. He just looked at me with the cold, calculating stare he reserved for bad investments and broken machinery. "Listen to your mother, Clara," Richard said, his voice dropping into the authoritative register he used in his corporate boardrooms. "We have professional photographers coming to the VIP tent immediately after the ceremony. We are using these photos for the company newsletter and our annual defense contractor gala. I need you to stay out of the frame entirely. It is nothing personal, but having you standing there looking like a low-level government IT worker does not align with our brand image." He adjusted his expensive silk tie, leaning in slightly to deliver the final blow. "You made your choice years ago when you refused to join the family business. I offered you a vice president position. I offered you a corner office and a 6-figure salary to manage our corporate networks. Instead, you decided to run off and play tech support for the government on a meager civil service salary. You chose to be a nobody who fixes routers. So today you will stay in the background like a nobody. Do not ruin your brother's big day with your petty jealousy just because he achieved something real." Jealousy. The word hung in the humid Virginia air. They honestly believed I was envious of Jason. Jason, who had to be tutored 3 times just to pass basic college calculus. Jason, who only got accepted into the officer candidate school because my father made a massive political donation to a local congressman and pulled every string imaginable. They were looking at a spoiled man-child who practically bought his way into a uniform, and they were actually comparing him to me. A normal person would have screamed at them right there in the parking lot. A normal person would have thrown the years of emotional neglect right back in their faces. I could have easily reminded my mother that she did not even bother to call me when I was hospitalized with pneumonia 2 years ago because she was too busy at a country club charity luncheon. I could have reminded my father that he skipped my college graduation entirely just to play golf with a titanium supplier. But I did not raise my voice, I did not flinch, and I did not shed a single tear. In the highest levels of cyber warfare, you do not show the enemy your source code before the strike is executed. You let them think they have total control of the system, right up until the exact moment the screens go black and the alarms start blaring. I looked at my mother's sneer, my father's absolute disdain, and my brother's obnoxious, arrogant grin. I absorbed every insult, every dismissive wave of their hands, with a terrifying absolute calm. I let their cruel words wash over me like water off the reinforced hull of a submarine. "If that is what you want," I replied, my voice dangerously soft and completely devoid of emotion. I will stay entirely out of your family photos. I will not sit anywhere near your VIP section. I will stand exactly where I belong today. Richard nodded, a smug look of satisfaction crossing his face, as he wrongly assumed he had successfully bullied me into submission yet again. Good. Go find a seat in the back bleachers. And try not to make a scene when Jason takes the stage to get his rank pinned on. We have highly important networking to do with the base commanders. They turned their backs on me in unison, a united front of corporate greed and fake prestige. They walked arm in arm toward the heavily guarded security checkpoint, leaving me standing by my car. They were completely unaware that the countdown to their absolute destruction had already begun. I watched my parents and brother walk away toward the heavily guarded security checkpoint. I was just about to reach into my pocket for my secured phone when the sharp click of designer stilettos on the concrete stopped me. It was Naomi. At 29 years old, my sister-in-law was a formidable African-American corporate lawyer who had married into my family 2 years ago. She had seamlessly integrated herself into their culture of greed and vanity, drawn to the family trust fund like a moth to a very expensive flame. Naomi moved with the calculated predatory grace of a woman who billed $900 an hour to dismantle opposing counsel. She had intentionally lingered behind the others, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver her own specialized brand of cruelty. Naomi stopped right in front of me, smoothing down her immaculate silk dress that clung perfectly to her figure. She flashed me an overly sweet, blindingly white smile. It was the exact same manufactured warmth she used in the courtroom right before she destroyed a hostile witness on the stand. "Hi, Clara," Naomi said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I am so glad you actually decided to show up today. I told Jason we should at least let you watch from the back. It is important for you to see what real success looks like." I did not reply. I just stared at her, maintaining my absolute stillness, waiting for the inevitable transaction I knew was coming. Naomi never spoke to me unless she wanted something or wanted to remind me of my place in the dirt. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick, heavy cardstock envelope, holding it out to me with a perfectly manicured hand. When I did not take it immediately, she forcefully tucked it into the fold of my dark trench coat pocket, patting it down as if I were a child. "I took the liberty of bringing the dinner invoice directly to you," Naomi continued, her tone shifting from sweet to strictly transactional. "Jason's commissioning celebration is tonight at the Waterfront Steakhouse. The family has rented out the entire top floor, complete with imported champagne and a custom ice sculpture. The bill comes to exactly $15,000. I looked down at the edge of the envelope protruding from my pocket, then back up to her perfectly contoured face. $15,000. They were trying to force me to bankroll the very party I was not even invited to attend as an equal. Naomi let out a short, condescending laugh, misinterpreting my silence as shock. "Do not look so pathetic, Clara. It is a standard private dining fee for people of our status. And Jason and I discussed it last night. We both agreed that you should be the one to pay for it. After all, what else are you possibly spending your money on? You are 34 years old, completely single, and you have absolutely zero dependents. You just sit alone in a sad little office doing basic computer work for the government. You must have a little bit of savings tucked away from your meager paychecks. It is the absolute least you can do to support your brother, especially since you have never accomplished anything worthy of a celebration yourself." I let her words hang in the heavy, humid air. She was a civil corporate lawyer trying to intimidate a woman who routinely stared down international cyber terrorists. The $15,000 bill meant absolutely nothing to me. My annual flag officer salary and top-tier government security clearances afforded me a life they could not even begin to comprehend. But Naomi was not finished. She wanted to make sure I felt entirely inadequate as a woman, not just as a professional. Naomi lifted her left hand deliberately, pretending to shield her eyes from the morning sun. The light caught the massive, flawless diamond ring on her finger. It was a custom piece easily worth $50,000, practically blinding in the daylight. Besides, Naomi said, dropping her voice into a mockingly pitying whisper as she admired the stone, Jason works so hard to secure our future. He deserves to be celebrated properly. Your parents even unlocked a portion of the family trust fund just to buy me this ring when he proposed. They know how important it is to project power and wealth in our circles. It is a real shame you will never get to experience this kind of partnership luxury or family support. She let her dark eyes drop deliberately to my bare hands resting quietly by my sides. No ring, no expensive bracelets, just the steady, unadorned hands of someone who actually worked to protect the country. Just pay the bill by 6 o'clock, Clara Naomi sneered, dropping the fake sweetness entirely and revealing the cold opportunist underneath. And do not even think about showing up to the dinner in that awful civilian coat. With a final dismissive hair flip, Naomi turned on her heel and strutted away to join the rest of the family at the VIP gates. She walked away completely convinced she had just ruined my day, established her dominance, and emptied my bank account. She had absolutely no idea that the diamond ring on her finger, the trust fund she was so proudly bragging about, and the very ground she was walking on, were about to become federal evidence. I took the heavy envelope from Naomi without a single word of protest. I let my fingers trace the embossed gold logo of the waterfront steakhouse on the premium paper, keeping my expression entirely blank. Naomi gave me one last victorious smirk, genuinely believing my silence was the ultimate sign of submission. She turned and strutted after my parents and Jason, her stilettos clicking rhythmically against the pavement like a countdown clock. I stood perfectly still by my vehicle, watching the four of them merge into the sea of arriving guests. They were laughing loudly, shaking hands with other wealthy defense contractors, and moving with the arrogant entitlement of people who truly believed they owned the world. They bypassed the long civilian security lines, flashing their premium access passes to the military police, and disappeared into the heavily guarded VIP entrance. They did not look back even once. Once they were completely out of sight, I moved away from the glaring morning sun and stepped into the cool shade of a massive concrete pillar. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my trench coat and pulled out a matte black biometric government smartphone. It was not a device you could buy in any civilian store. It was a classified piece of hardware wired directly to the United States Fleet Cyber Command secure networks. I pressed my thumb against the glass screen, the device recognizing my print instantly and bypassing multiple layers of firewall security. The screen illuminated with a stark green command prompt. I did not hesitate. I typed a single encrypted alphanumeric sequence, followed by a short definitive text directive. Operation Eagle is a go. Clear the VIP list. I hit send. The confirmation pinged back in less than a second. It was done. The gears of the United States Navy were now turning, and there was absolutely nothing my family could do to stop the incoming strike. I slid the secure phone back into my pocket and began the long walk toward the ceremony grounds. I did not head for the main VIP entrance where my family had gone. Instead, I took a perimeter path reserved strictly for active duty personnel. When I reached the restricted gate, I briefly opened my trench coat to flash a specialized identification card to the armed guard. The young sailor saw the credentials, his eyes widened instantly, and he snapped to a rigid attention, opening the heavy steel gate for me without a single question. As I approached the main auditorium, the sheer scale of the event became apparent. It was breathtaking. The massive outdoor pavilion was meticulously arranged right on the edge of the harbor. Behind the stage, the towering steel hulls of aircraft carriers and guided missile destroyers sat docked in the water, their radar arrays spinning silently. The morning sun gleamed off the weapon systems of the fleet, serving as a massive, silent testament to the raw power of the armed forces. Thousands of people were already seated. Proud family members, friends, and military personnel filled the grandstands, creating a sea of colorful summer dresses mixed with crisp, sharply ironed military uniforms. The naval band was playing a steady patriotic march, the brass instruments echoing powerfully across the waterfront. Brightly colored flags snapped fiercely in the salty ocean breeze. At the very front of the pavilion, cordoned off by heavy velvet ropes and flanked by stern-looking military police, was the VIP seating area. I spotted them immediately. My parents, Jason and Naomi, were sitting dead center in the front row, treating the section like their own personal kingdom. Richard was busy shaking hands with a local politician, boasting loudly about his latest defense contract. Patricia was fanning herself with a glossy ceremony program, looking down her nose at the enlisted families sitting in the rows behind them. Jason was practically vibrating with excitement, fixing his posture and checking his reflection in his phone screen every time a base photographer walked past. They looked so incredibly secure in their false reality. They were basking in the glory of their wealth, their status, and their manufactured success, entirely oblivious to the digital trap that had just snapped shut around them. I found a quiet spot in the shadows near the side stage entrance, out of direct view of the audience, but with a perfect, unobstructed vantage point of the entire pavilion. I crossed my arms and waited quietly in the dark. The music suddenly swelled the brass section, hitting a high, triumphant note, signaling the official start of the commissioning ceremony. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the heavy wooden podium, adjusting the microphone. A respectful hush quickly fell over the thousands of attendees. My brother leaned forward in his front row seat, his eyes locked intensely on the stage, eagerly waiting for his name to be called. He thought this was the moment he would finally become a commissioned officer. He had absolutely no idea that instead of a promotion, he was about to face the wrath of a 4-star admiral and the complete public annihilation of our family empire. The color guard marched down the center aisle, their boots hitting the pavement in perfect thunderous unison. The sharp command of present arms echoed across the waterfront, followed instantly by the crisp metallic snap of hundreds of rifles being brought up in a flawless salute. The military band transitioned seamlessly into the national anthem. Standing in the shadows off to the side, I watched the massive American flag snap against the halyard. The tradition, the discipline, the sheer weight of naval history hung heavy in the air. This was an institution built on honor, a concept my family viewed merely as a marketing buzzword to secure government funding. Down in the front row, my parents were treating this solemn military tradition like a corporate networking event. Even as the crowd remained silent and respectful, I could see my father Richard leaning over the velvet rope to aggressively shake hands with a nearby base commander. He was not whispering. He was shamelessly plugging his manufacturing company, loudly bragging about how his son possessed a brilliant military mind that would single-handedly revolutionize naval tactics. I watched him aggressively hand the commander a glossy business card right in the middle of the invocation. My mother, Patricia, was holding court with the wives of other high-ranking officials, flashing her expensive dental veneers and gesturing proudly toward Jason. She was painting a picture of a patriotic, perfectly unified family, completely ignoring the daughter she had just banished to the parking lot like a stray dog. Jason sat right between them, practically vibrating with unearned entitlement. He kept adjusting the collar of his dress whites, ensuring the heavy fabric sat perfectly against his neck for the cameras. He leaned back in his folding chair with his legs crossed, projecting the smug aura of a man who believed he had already conquered the world. He kept glancing over his shoulder, making sure the base photographers were capturing his profile from the optimal angle. He did not look like a man prepared to serve his country or sacrifice his comfort. He looked like a spoiled heir waiting to be crowned. Naomi sat next to him, checking her phone and fixing her lipstick, ready to play the role of the devoted military wife the second the flashbulbs started popping. She kept polishing that massive $50,000 diamond ring on her sleeve, making sure it caught the morning sun. The opening remarks concluded, and a ripple of anticipation moved through the massive crowd. The master of ceremonies, a stern-looking captain with rows of colorful ribbons covering his chest, stepped up to the heavy wooden podium. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked out over the sea of anxious candidates. The commissioning of a naval officer is not just a promotion. The captain's voice boomed through the massive stadium speakers, carrying clearly over the sound of the ocean wind. It is a sacred oath. It requires absolute integrity, unwavering character, and a commitment to truth above all else. I almost laughed out loud in the shadows. Integrity and truth were two things my brother had never encountered in his entire privileged life. He had bought his way out of every consequence since middle school. The captain picked up the heavy leather-bound binder containing the official commissioning roster. The crowd fell completely silent. Family members raised their cameras and phones, holding their breath in anticipation. Jason leaned forward, placing his hands firmly on his knees, his chest puffed out to maximum capacity. My father had paid a small fortune to political fixers to ensure his son's name was at the absolute top of the list for this ceremony, wanting him to be the very first candidate called to the stage so he could dominate the local news cycle and the corporate newsletter. The captain leaned closely into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the stage for our first candidate, for the rank of Lieutenant Candidate Jason." My brother stood up instantly. He flashed a brilliant rehearsed smile to the audience, buttoned his jacket with a swift practiced motion, and took a highly confident step toward the center aisle. Patricia let out a loud, embarrassing cheer, and Richard started clapping aggressively, practically shoving a base photographer out of the way to get a better camera angle. But Jason's foot never hit the ground for his second step. The captain opened his mouth to finish the formal introduction, but instead of words, a deafening high-pitched screech ripped through the massive stadium speakers. The audio feedback was so violent and sudden that half the crowd immediately covered their ears in pain. The microphone cut out completely. The brass band stopped playing. The photographers lowered their cameras in confusion. My brother froze perfectly still in the middle of the aisle, his arrogant smile faltering as a heavy, deeply uncomfortable silence swallowed the entire pavilion. The heavy silence lasted only a few seconds before the rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed from the rear of the stage. The master of ceremonies stepped back, looking completely bewildered, as the heavy velvet curtains behind the podium were shoved aside. A collective gasp rippled through the thousands of attendees. Stepping into the bright morning sun was not a sound technician coming to fix the broken microphone. It was Admiral Kensington. He was a 4-star admiral, the supreme commander of the entire naval fleet, and a man whose mere presence commanded absolute terrifying authority. He was dressed in his immaculate summer whites, the 4 heavy gold stars gleaming on his shoulder boards. But he was not walking with the slow, measured pace of a ceremonial guest. He was marching with deliberate tactical urgency. Flanking him on either side were 4 heavily armed military police officers. These were not the ceremonial guards standing by the gates. These were master-at-arms personnel wearing tactical vests, secured sidearms, and expressions made of pure stone. They moved in perfect synchronization with the admiral, their eyes scanning the crowd for potential threats. The sudden shift in atmosphere was jarring. The celebratory mood evaporated instantly, replaced by a tense, palpable anxiety that settled over the entire pavilion. Down in the front row, my father leaned forward eagerly. He completely misread the room. I could see the greedy calculations running behind his eyes. Richard nudged my mother, whispering loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear that he must have called in a massive favor from his Pentagon contacts. He actually believed that a 4-star admiral had interrupted a standard commissioning ceremony just to personally honor his golden child. Patricia sat up straighter, fixing her hair and preparing her best aristocratic smile for the cameras. Naomi quickly pulled out her smartphone, ready to record the moment her husband received the ultimate military validation. Jason, standing frozen in the center aisle, seemed to draw the exact same delusional conclusion. The initial shock melted off his face, quickly replaced by a radiant, blindingly arrogant grin. He puffed out his chest, completely convinced that he was the absolute center of the universe. As Admiral Kensington approached the front edge of the stage, Jason took a highly confident step forward to meet him. He stood at the bottom of the wooden stairs, adjusting his posture to look as heroic as possible. He extended his right hand outward, fully expecting the supreme commander of the fleet to reach down, shake it, and offer him a personal commendation in front of thousands of people. "Good morning, Admiral," Jason projected his voice loudly, trying to sound deep and commanding without the aid of the broken microphone. "It is an absolute honor to have you here for my commissioning." What happened next defies all logic in my brother's privileged, sheltered world. Admiral Kensington did not smile. He did not slow down. He did not even blink. He looked straight through Jason as if my brother were nothing more than a transparent pane of glass. The Admiral descended the wooden stairs with heavy, echoing steps. Jason stood there with his hand extended in the air, his smile freezing awkwardly on his face. As Kensington reached the bottom of the stairs, the lead military police officer did not hesitate. He stepped forward and firmly shoved Jason by the shoulder, physically moving him out of the Supreme Commander's path. "Move aside, candidate!" the officer barked loudly, his voice carrying the harsh, undeniable authority of federal law. Jason stumbled backward, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the pavement. He looked utterly humiliated, his extended hand dropping uselessly to his side. Richard stood up from his front row seat, his face flushing red with sudden anger. He opened his mouth to protest, ready to demand answers and throw his weight around as a wealthy defense contractor, but one sharp, icy glare from the armed guards forced him immediately back into his folding chair. Admiral Kensington ignored the entire family. He turned his broad shoulders away from the center aisle and began walking purposefully down the side pathway. The crowd parted instantly, pulling their children back and holding their breath. He walked right past the shocked politicians, right past the bewildered master of ceremonies, and headed straight toward the dark, shaded corner of the pavilion. He was walking directly toward me. The entire audience turned their heads, thousands of pairs of eyes following the Supreme Commander as he marched away from the Golden Boy and into the shadows. My parents stretched their necks desperately trying to see who the Admiral was approaching. They still thought I was sitting in the parking lot. They had no idea that the woman standing quietly in the dark, waiting for the commander of the fleet, was the exact same daughter they had just tried to erase. The rhythmic thud of Admiral Kensington's heavy boots grew louder as he closed the distance between the center aisle and the shaded perimeter where I stood. Thousands of heads swiveled in unison, a massive wave of silent anticipation rolling through the crowd. Down in the front row, my father stepped completely out of the VIP rope line, his eyes squinting against the glare of the harbor sun. My mother had dropped her glossy ceremony program on the pavement. Jason remained frozen at the bottom of the stage stairs, looking like a discarded theater prop. They were all desperately trying to identify the highly important figure who had just derailed the entire event. I did not wait for the Admiral to enter the darkness. It was time to bring the truth into the light. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, crossing the threshold from the deep shadows into the blazing morning sun. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows as my face became fully visible to the audience. I locked eyes directly with my father. I watched the blood drain completely from his face in less than a second. His jaw dropped, his arrogant posture instantly crumbling into a posture of sheer, unadulterated shock. He recognized his daughter. He recognized the woman he had just banished to the parking lot. But his wealthy corporate brain still could not comprehend why the Supreme Commander of the Naval Fleet was marching directly toward me. I kept my eyes locked on my family as my hands moved to the collar of my dark civilian trench coat. I grabbed the top button, undoing it with a sharp, decisive flick of my wrist. I moved to the second button, then the third, my movements methodical and completely unbothered by the thousands of people staring at me. My mother gripped the velvet rope, her knuckles turning completely white, her eyes wide with a sudden creeping terror. She knew something catastrophic was happening, but her mind refused to process the reality unfolding in front of her. With the final button undone, I grasped the lapels of the heavy coat and shoved them backward. I let the dark fabric slide smoothly off my shoulders, letting it fall freely to the concrete floor where it landed with a soft, heavy thud. The gasp that tore through the pavilion this time was not just from my family. It was from every military official, every sailor, and every guest in the massive stadium. I was not wearing civilian clothes. I was standing in the immaculate, perfectly tailored summer white uniform of the United States Navy. The pristine white fabric caught the brilliant sunlight, practically glowing against the backdrop of the gray steel warships in the harbor. But it was not the uniform itself that paralyzed the crowd. It was the absolute weight of the rank I carried. Fastened securely to my shoulder boards were the thick, unmistakable gold bands and the heavy silver star of a rear admiral lower half. My chest was not empty. It was heavily decorated with rows of colorful ribbons and commendations, including the Defense Superior Service Medal and the Legion of Merit. These were not ceremonial participation trophies bought with political donations. They were the highest honors awarded for exceptionally meritorious service to the government in duties of great responsibility. I was a flag officer, a titan of the military hierarchy, standing right in front of the family who had spent 34 years treating me like an incompetent failure. Admiral Kensington reached my position. He stopped exactly 3 paces in front of me, his posture incredibly rigid. The 4 heavily armed military police officers flanking him stopped simultaneously, their boots slamming into the concrete as they snapped into a flawless position of attention. The entire waterfront was so quiet, you could hear the heavy ropes clinking against the flagpoles in the ocean breeze. Jason was staring at me from the stage, his mouth hanging open, his perfectly rehearsed smile replaced by a look of absolute soul-crushing horror. He was looking at the gold stars on my shoulders, realizing that his own sister heavily outranked every single officer he had ever met in his entire life. He was a candidate who had not even earned a single silver bar, and I was an admiral. Admiral Kensington did not hesitate. He raised his right hand in a razor-sharp, textbook-perfect salute. He held it there, offering the ultimate gesture of military respect to a superior officer. When he spoke, he did not use a microphone, but his deep, commanding voice boomed effortlessly across the silent pavilion, echoing off the steel hulls of the destroyers docked behind us. "Ma'am, Fleet Cyber Command is standing by for your orders." The words hit the VIP section like a tactical missile strike. My father collapsed backward into his folding chair, as if his legs had completely given out. Naomi dropped her smartphone onto the pavement, the glass screen shattering instantly into a dozen pieces. The universe as they knew it had just been completely incinerated. I returned the Admiral's salute with perfect precision, dropping my hand sharply to my side, entirely ready to deliver the final blow. The words hung in the air, echoing across the silent waterfront. "Fleet Cyber Command is standing by for your orders." Down in the front row, the carefully constructed facade of my family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. My mother, Patricia, stood completely frozen, her eyes wide with a horrified disbelief that bordered on absolute panic. Her fingers went entirely slack, and her custom designer purse slipped from her grasp, hitting the concrete pavement with a heavy, dull thud. Expensive cosmetics and silver mint tins spilled out around her high heels, but she did not even blink. She just kept staring at the heavy gold stars on my shoulders, her mind violently rejecting the reality that the daughter she had just mocked was now commanding the most powerful military network on the planet. Beside her, my father looked as if all the blood had been siphoned directly out of his veins. Richard fell back into his folding chair, his face turning a sickly ashen gray. The arrogant corporate titan who had spent his entire morning bragging about his political connections was suddenly gasping for air. His jaw worked silently up and down, but no sound came out. In his world of defense, contracting rank was everything. It was currency. It was power. And in a fraction of a second he realized that his so-called worthless daughter possessed a level of federal authority that could crush his $500 million company with a single signature. The heavy silence was finally broken by a sharp click from the stadium sound system. Up on the stage, the master of ceremonies had received a new directive. An aide had rushed from the command tent and handed him a secure red-bordered folder. The captain adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and leaned into the newly activated microphone. His voice was no longer celebratory. It was steeped in absolute rigid reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, his voice booming over the thousands of stunned guests. "Please direct your attention to the floor. It is my distinct honor to introduce the true guest of honor for today's proceedings. Appointed directly by the Pentagon and confirmed by the Senate Armed Services Committee, she is the youngest flag officer in modern naval history." A fresh wave of shock washed over the crowd. People in the grandstands began to stand up, craning their necks to get a better look at me. My father gripped his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the announcer continued. "She is the chief architect of the nation's unbreakable defense grid." The captain read, broadcasting the unclassified version of my highly classified life. "She is the director of the United States Fleet Cyber Command, holding ultimate authority over global naval digital infrastructure signals, intelligence, and cyber warfare operations. Please render honors to Rear Admiral Clara." The military band instantly struck up the official flag officer march. The heavy brass music soared into the sky, demanding respect and absolute compliance. I lowered my hand from the salute and began walking toward the stage. The military police officers immediately stepped into formation behind me, acting as my personal security detail. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. High-ranking officers, men and women who had spent decades in the service, stood at strict attention and saluted as I walked past them. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at Naomi, who was still staring at her shattered phone on the ground. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, fixed entirely on the golden boy standing at the bottom of the stage stairs. Jason looked pathetic. The arrogant swagger he had carried at the security gate was completely gone. He was trembling. His pristine white uniform suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume compared to the genuine weight of the commendations on my chest. As I stopped right in front of him, the height difference between us no longer mattered. I looked down at him with the cold, calculating stare of a commanding officer observing a massive tactical failure. Jason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He tried to force a smile, a desperate, sickening attempt to reclaim the familiar sibling dynamic, where he held all the power, and I was just his lesser counterpart. "Clara, what is going on?" Jason stammered, his voice cracking horribly. "Clara, I do not understand why you are wearing that." He never got to finish his sentence. The lead military police officer standing at my right shoulder stepped forward with terrifying speed. He closed the distance between them, leaning directly into Jason's face, with a look of pure, unadulterated menace. "You will stand at the position of attention candidate," the officer barked, his voice echoing fiercely over the music. "And you will address the Admiral by her proper military title." Jason flinched violently, his eyes darting frantically between the armed guard and my face. He snapped his heels together, his hands shaking as he pinned them tightly to his sides. He looked at me, his childhood punching bag, the sister he had just tried to banish to the bleachers, and he finally spoke the word that sealed his fate. "Admiral," he whispered. I smiled. It was a cold, merciless expression. And now the real ceremony was about to begin. I stepped past my trembling brother and approached the heavy wooden podium. The master of ceremonies respectfully stepped back, handing me the microphone without a single word. I looked out over the thousands of people gathered in the pavilion. The sea of crisp uniforms, the proud families in the grandstands, and directly in the front row, my own family completely shattered by the reality of my existence. I adjusted the microphone, the metallic click echoing loudly in the absolute silence. The ocean breeze whipped the flags above us, but the crowd was so still you could have heard a pin drop on the concrete. "When you wear this uniform," I began, my voice steady and echoing across the harbor with absolute authority, "you make a sacred vow. You pledge to protect the nation, to uphold the highest standards of integrity, and to lead with honor. A naval officer is entrusted with the lives of sailors and the security of the free world. It is a privilege that cannot be bought with corporate wealth manipulated by political connections or handed out as a family favor. It must be earned through uncompromising character and absolute truth. I turned my head slowly, locking my gaze on Jason. He looked like a cornered animal, sweating profusely inside his starched white collar. His eyes begged me to stop, silently pleading with me to keep the family secrets hidden behind closed doors, just like we always did. He expected me to fold to protect the family brand at the expense of my own duty, but I was not here to play their toxic games anymore. "Candidate Jason," I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the massive stadium could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "You have fundamentally failed to meet the moral and legal requirements of this institution. Effective immediately by the authority vested in me by the United States Navy, your commissioning is officially suspended." A collective gasp erupted from the thousands of attendees. The sound of a massive crowd inhaling in shock was deafening. Whispers instantly broke out across the bleachers. Down in the front row, my father suddenly found his voice. Richard lunged at the velvet rope, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that the ceremony continue. He yelled that he was a top-tier defense contractor, that he personally knew the Secretary of Defense, and that I was nothing but an ungrateful, jealous daughter trying to ruin his company image. Two heavily armed military police officers instantly stepped in front of him, placing their hands firmly on their holstered weapons, forcing the corporate titan to sit back down in total humiliation. My mother simply covered her face with her trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as her perfect social facade was ripped to shreds. On stage, Jason completely broke military protocol. He lunged toward me, dropping his rigid posture, his hands reaching out in a desperate, pathetic panic. "Clara, please, you cannot do this to me," he pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine terror and disbelief. "I did everything I was supposed to do. Dad paid for the prep courses. You are ruining my life. Do not do this to our family." I did not take a single step back. I looked at him with absolute zero sympathy. "I am not ruining your life, Jason," I replied coldly, stepping away from the microphone so only he and the guards could hear my final judgment. "You ruined it the second you decided you were above the federal law." I turned to the lead master at arms standing at the edge of the stage. "Take the candidate into federal custody." The military police moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. Before Jason could even process the order, two heavily armed guards grabbed his arms, spinning him around forcefully. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed over the staging area. Jason let out a pathetic, high-pitched yelp as they locked his hands firmly behind his back. The pristine white uniform he had bragged about all morning was suddenly transformed into a symbol of his absolute disgrace. "No wait call, Dad!" Jason screamed, thrashing wildly as the guards began marching him toward the rear exit of the stage. "Call the lawyers! Naomi, do something!" But his wife did not move an inch. Naomi just stared at him from the front row, her sharp legal mind rapidly calculating the catastrophic damage. As a corporate lawyer, she knew exactly what federal handcuffs meant. The crowd watched in stunned, breathless silence as the golden child, the heir to a massive corporate empire, was dragged off the stage like a common criminal. I stood at the podium watching him disappear behind the heavy velvet curtains. The public execution was over. Now it was time to move to the interrogation room and dismantle the rest of their empire. The transition from the blinding sunlight of the waterfront pavilion to the harsh fluorescent lights of the federal holding room was jarring. Deep inside the Tactical Administration Building, the air was heavily air-conditioned and smelled faintly of floor wax and ozone. The room was designed for high-level interrogations. It was entirely soundproofed, featuring concrete walls painted a sterile gray and a heavy steel table bolted directly to the center of the floor. Jason sat slumped in a metal chair in the far corner, his wrists still firmly secured behind his back, with heavy federal handcuffs. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his ruined white uniform, his eyes darting frantically around the windowless room. My parents and Naomi had been escorted into the room by armed military police shortly after I left the stage. As the heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, sealing us inside, the sheer volume of my father's rage instantly shattered the quiet. "You ungrateful, vindictive little psycho." Richard screamed, his face contorted into a mask of absolute fury. He lunged across the room toward me, but a military police officer instantly stepped into his path, placing a heavy hand on his chest and forcing him back. Richard slapped the officer's hand away, pacing the length of the small room like a caged animal. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at my face. "You think because you put on a fancy white uniform and got a few shiny medals that you can do this to me? To my son. I am the chief executive officer of a $500 million defense contracting firm. I supply the titanium components for the very nuclear submarines your commanders sail in. I own the supply chains that keep this entire base operational." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I slowly unbuttoned the collar of my uniform jacket and walked calmly past him, heading straight for the small metal coffee station set up in the corner of the room. "Are you even listening to me?" Richard bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging dangerously against his expensive silk tie. "You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I play golf with members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I have the personal cell phone number of the Secretary of Defense on speed dial. I can make one phone call right now and have your entire career wiped out before lunchtime. I will have you stripped of that rank, dishonorably discharged, and court-martialed for abusing your federal authority to settle a petty family grudge." I picked up a white foam cup and reached for the glass coffee pot. The room was so quiet between his screaming fits that the sound of the dark liquid pouring into the cup echoed clearly. I took my time. I added absolutely nothing to the black coffee, mirroring the bitter, unadulterated reality I was about to serve them. My mother, Patricia, was leaning heavily against the concrete wall, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. "Clara, stop this nonsense right now," she cried, her voice shrill and desperate. "Tell these guards to take those handcuffs off your brother. This is a massive misunderstanding. You are embarrassing the family brand in front of the entire military command. You are destroying everything your father has built, just because you were always jealous of Jason's success." Jealous. They were still clinging to that pathetic narrative. Even as I stood before them wearing the stars of an admiral, they desperately needed to believe I was just the bitter, inadequate daughter acting out for attention. Richard slammed his fist down heavily onto the metal table, the loud bang startling Jason into a fresh fit of quiet sobbing. "You will order these men to release my son immediately," Richard demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, guttural growl. "And then you will walk out to that podium and tell the press that this was all a terrible security drill. If you do not fix this right now, Clara, I swear to God, I will use every single dollar of my corporate wealth to absolutely bury you. I will hire a team of lawyers to drag your name through the mud until you are begging to work at a mall tech support desk. You are nothing but a mistake. You have always been a mistake." I took a slow, deliberate sip of the scalding black coffee. The heat bloomed in my chest, a grounding contrast to the freezing panic radiating from my family. I turned around to face my father, leaning casually against the coffee counter. I looked at his red, sweating face, his trembling hands, and his desperate, empty threats. I let him scream. I let him dig his grave deeper with every arrogant word, perfectly aware that the audio recording devices embedded in the ceiling were capturing his threats to a federal officer in pristine high definition. "Are you quite finished?" I asked softly, my voice cutting through his hysterical rage like a razor blade. Richard opened his mouth to scream again, but the absolute terrifying calm in my eyes finally made him hesitate. He stared at me, the first tiny sliver of genuine doubt beginning to crack through his corporate armor. He was slowly starting to realize that all his money and all his political connections were completely useless in this room. The heavy silence stretched through the sterile room as my father stared at me. For the first time in his privileged, untouchable life, the reality of absolute defeat began to sink in. His mouth opened and closed silently, his aggressive posture deflating like a punctured tire. He had thrown his absolute best threats at me, invoking powerful senators and massive defense contracts, and I had simply sipped my coffee. He stepped back, his chest still heaving completely out of ammunition. Seeing her husband's intimidation tactics utterly fail, my mother instantly shifted her strategy. Patricia stepped forward, pushing past Richard. Her face, previously twisted in aristocratic disgust, suddenly melted into a mask of profound, tragic victimhood. The tears arrived right on cue, spilling over her expensive mascara as she clutched her diamond necklace. She reached out with a trembling hand, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. Clara, how can you be so incredibly cruel? Patricia sobbed, her voice echoing shrilly off the concrete walls. She pointed a manicured finger at Jason, who was still hunched over in the metal chair, sniffling pathetically in his handcuffs. Look at your brother. Look at what you are doing to him. He is terrified. You are completely destroying his entire future, his entire life over what? Over your own petty, deep-seated jealousy. I lowered my coffee cup slowly, watching her perform. The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was almost impressive. You have always been like this. Patricia continued, her voice gaining a hysterical, theatrical momentum. You could never just let Jason have his moment. You always had to drag him down to make yourself feel bigger. Just like your senior year of high school. Jason was playing in the state baseball championship, the most important athletic achievement of his entire teenage life, and you deliberately invited that local news reporter to our house on the exact same afternoon to interview you about winning some meaningless national coding competition. You purposefully tried to steal his spotlight that day, and you are doing the exact same thing right now. She took a step closer to me, her fake tears flowing faster. She truly believed that if she rewrote history loudly enough, I would suddenly feel guilty and fold. She conveniently left out the fact that the coding competition had awarded me a full academic scholarship to a top-tier university, effectively freeing me from their financial control, while Jason had struck out 3 times and lost his game. To her, my entire existence was nothing but a deliberate inconvenience to Jason's glory. You are 34 years old, Clara, my mother cried, pressing her hands against her chest in a dramatic display of maternal agony. When are you going to grow up and stop punishing us for your own insecurities? He is your family. We are your family. You are abusing the power of the federal government to settle a pathetic childhood rivalry. I am begging you to stop this madness. Tell these military guards to take those handcuffs off him right now. Let him walk back out there and get his commission. You have already ruined the ceremony and humiliated us in front of the entire base command. What more could you possibly want from us? Jason whimpered from the corner, leaning into my mother's narrative. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. Tell them it was a mistake, Clara, he pleaded weakly. Please, I am supposed to be a lieutenant. I stood perfectly still, letting the echoes of their pathetic whining fade into the hum of the air conditioning unit. I looked at Patricia's tear-stained face, then at Richard's defeated scowl, and finally at Jason's trembling frame. Naomi stood quietly by the door, her sharp legal eyes darting between us, calculating the shifting power dynamics. My parents were a perfectly synchronized machine of manipulation, seamlessly pivoting from violent threats to crying victims the second they realized they were trapped. They desperately wanted me to engage in an emotional screaming match. They wanted me to defend my past, to argue about high school, to validate their twisted version of reality. I did not give them a single word of emotional validation. I turned away from the coffee station and walked slowly toward the heavy steel table bolted to the center of the room. I set my foam cup down. I reached inside the deep inner pocket of my tailored uniform jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. The top right corner was stamped with bold red ink, indicating top secret federal clearance. I did not break eye contact with my mother as I raised the folder in the air and dropped it flat onto the metal table. The loud, sharp smack of the heavy document hitting the steel cut through Patricia's fake sobbing like a gunshot. She flinched backward, her mouth snapping shut instantly. The folder sat there under the harsh fluorescent lights, radiating an undeniable catastrophic threat. The sharp metallic echo of the heavy folder hitting the table hung in the air for only a few seconds before the rhythmic click of high heels broke the silence. Naomi stepped away from the heavy steel door. She had watched my parents fail spectacularly, with their screaming and crying, and now she was ready to take absolute control of the room. She was not going to play the role of the grieving family member. She was shifting seamlessly into full corporate lawyer mode, ready to deploy the ruthless tactics that made her a highly feared partner at her firm. She reached into the tailored pocket of her designer blazer and pulled out a sleek silver digital voice recorder. Her primary smartphone might have been shattered on the pavement outside, but a high-powered attorney always carried a backup dictation device. She pressed the record button with a sharp click, the small red light illuminating like a warning beacon in the dim, sterile room. She held the device up, pointing the microphone directly at me with supreme confidence. For the official record, Naomi began, her voice crisp, authoritative, and completely stripped of the fake sweetness she had used against me in the parking lot. My name is Naomi, senior partner at Harrison and Wright. I am officially acting as legal counsel for candidate Jason and the entire family. What you are doing here, Clara, is not a legitimate military operation. It is a gross, vindictive abuse of power, and I will not allow it to continue for another second. Jason lifted his head from his chest, a pathetic glimmer of hope washing over his tear-stained face. His brilliant, ruthless wife was finally stepping into the ring to save him. Richard stood up a little straighter, his corporate confidence momentarily returning as he crossed his arms. Patricia wiped her eyes and nodded vigorously. They were suddenly a united front again, hiding cowardly behind the shield of expensive legal representation. Naomi paced slowly around the steel table, keeping a careful distance from the classified folder. You have publicly humiliated my client in front of thousands of civilian and military witnesses. She stated her words rapid and razor-sharp. You have ordered armed personnel to physically detain him without a formally stated charge, which constitutes false imprisonment and unlawful detainment under federal law. Furthermore, your little theatrical stunt on that stage was textbook defamation of character and intentional infliction of severe emotional distress. I stood perfectly still watching her parade around the interrogation room. She was treating a federal military holding cell like a local civil courtroom. She honestly believed that her Ivy League law degree and aggressive posturing could intimidate a flag officer who routinely authorized international cyber strikes. I am drafting an emergency injunction as we speak, Naomi threatened, stopping right across the table from me. If you do not order these guards to remove those handcuffs and release my husband this exact instant, I will file a massive civil lawsuit that will utterly bankrupt you. I will drag your name, your rank, and your precious military reputation through federal court until you are stripped of your pension and publicly disgraced. You are out of your depth, Clara. You might wear the uniform, but I own the courtroom. You have no legal grounds to hold a civilian in military custody. Let him go. Now. I listened to her entire speech without interrupting a single syllable. I did not blink, and I did not break eye contact. When she finally finished her legal tirade, breathing heavily with self-righteous anger, I let out a soft, dark chuckle. It was a cold, humorless sound that immediately drained the newfound confidence right out of the room. My parents exchanged a nervous, terrified glance. Jason shrank back into his metal chair. I leaned forward, resting both my hands flat on the cold steel table right next to the classified folder. I looked directly at the small red recording light on her device, and then slowly shifted my gaze up to meet Naomi's eyes. The aggressive corporate fire in her expression faltered for a fraction of a second as she stared into the absolute terrifying calm of my demeanor. You are a very articulate lawyer, Naomi, I said, my voice completely deadpan, ringing with a chilling authority. And you have a very impressive grasp of civilian litigation. But you are currently standing inside a highly secured federal military installation representing a man who is actively being investigated for severe crimes against the United States government. I paused, letting the crushing weight of reality settle over her shoulders. I tapped a single finger against the cover of the classified folder. So before you officially enter yourself into the record as his legal counsel, I highly suggest you reach down and turn that recorder off. I smiled coldly, a predatory expression that made her take an involuntary step backward. That is, of course, if you have any intention of keeping your license to practice law. Naomi stared at the glowing red light on her silver voice recorder. The absolute certainty in my voice, combined with the chilling reality of the federal facility we were standing in, had finally pierced right through her aggressive corporate arrogance. A smart lawyer knows exactly when they are walking blindly into a federal trap, and Naomi was nothing if not calculating. Her jaw tightened, her perfectly manicured thumb hovering over the device for a heavy, agonizing second. With a stiff, almost robotic motion, she clicked the button. The small red light vanished. She slowly lowered her hand and took a deliberate step backward, retreating toward the concrete wall. She kept her dark eyes locked entirely on the classified folder sitting on the table, suddenly terrified of the radioactive secrets it contained. With the room finally silent and the baseless legal threats fully neutralized, I turned my attention back to the heavy manila folder. I reached out and flipped the thick cover open. The crisp, sharp sound of the heavy paper parting echoed loudly in the quiet room, sounding exactly like the final nail being driven into their collective coffin. Inside the folder was not a collection of petty family grievances, emotional diary entries, or old high school report cards. It was a massive stack of highly classified watermarked Federal Cyber Intercept logs, heavily redacted with thick black ink and stamped with the official seal of the Department of Defense. I slid the first thick packet of documents out from the stack. I pushed it slowly across the cold metal surface, so it sat perfectly in the center of the table, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead fluorescent lights. I looked directly at my brother, who was shivering violently in his metal chair. "Jason," I said, my voice cutting through the chilled air, "let us talk about your highly celebrated, brilliant military mind. The exact same mind our parents have been shamelessly bragging about to every single flag officer they could corner this morning." According to the unedited original testing matrix from the Naval Officer Candidate School, you did not just casually fail your final academic and tactical strategy exams. You completely bombed them with a historic level of sheer incompetence. Your raw scores were so abysmally low that the automated grading system initially flagged your test packet as a statistical anomaly. You did not even come close to the minimum passing threshold. You were officially slated for immediate dismissal from the candidate program exactly 3 weeks ago. My mother let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard stared at the thick stack of papers on the table, his eyes darting frantically back and forth, as if he could magically read the encrypted data from across the room. "But you did not pack your bags and go home in disgrace. Did you, Jason?" I continued, keeping my eyes locked onto his sweating face. "Because in this family, failure is an unacceptable reality, and consequences are always meant for the poor and the unconnected." I tapped my index finger firmly against the top page of the printed logs. These are the encrypted digital footprints pulled directly from the United States Fleet Cyber Command defense grid. They detail the exact sequence of events that occurred at 2 o'clock in the morning, on the very day your failing grades were finalized. Someone initiated a highly sophisticated external breach protocol. They bypassed the standard military firewall, accessed the secure naval academic database, and manually rewrote your failing test scores to perfect glowing marks across the entire board. Jason swallowed hard, his face turning the color of wet chalk. I leaned a few inches closer across the steel table, dropping my voice into a lethal, uncompromising whisper. "You are not a master hacker, Jason. We both know you can barely set up a commercial wireless router without calling a technician. So you took the path of least resistance. The digital forensics clearly and irrefutably show that the intrusion originated from a highly secured, heavily encrypted backdoor. A backdoor built directly into the private corporate servers of our father's defense manufacturing company." The silence that followed was completely suffocating. The crushing weight of the federal espionage charges hung heavily over the small room. Jason's face contorted in sheer, unadulterated panic. He violently shook his head, the heavy steel handcuffs rattling loudly and sharply against the back of his metal chair. He lunged forward as far as the strict restraints would possibly allow, his breathing turning into rapid, ragged gasps. He completely abandoned his arrogant persona, reverting instantly to a terrified child, cornered by his own actions. He turned his head frantically, looking away from the undeniable evidence on the table and locking his desperate eyes onto our father. "Tell her she is lying, Dad!" Jason screamed, his voice cracking with aggressive, absolute terror. "Tell her it is a fake. You have to fix this right now. Tell her to let me go." Richard stood completely frozen, his eyes glued to the classified documents sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights. He did not say a single word to comfort his panicking son. He could not. The corporate titan who always had a high-priced fixer on speed dial was entirely paralyzed by the irrefutable evidence sitting on the steel table. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer another empty threat or a desperate bribe, but no sound materialized. "He cannot fix this, Jason," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the interrogation room. "All the corporate money in his offshore accounts and all the political favors he has purchased over the last decade are completely useless right now. Because you did not just cheat on a standardized test." I took a slow, deliberate step around the heavy steel table, moving closer to the metal chair where my brother was furiously struggling against his federal restraints. "If you had simply paid another candidate to take your academic exams," I continued, keeping my tone coldly clinical, "you would have been quietly expelled from the program and sent home with a dishonorable discharge. It would have been an embarrassing scandal for the family brand, but it would have ended there. But you could not even do that, right? You are so accustomed to taking the lazy, arrogant route that you completely ignored the massive security protocols standing in your way." Jason stopped thrashing for a moment, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps as he stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You used a defense contractor's unencrypted private server to launch a direct digital intrusion into a restricted military database," I explained, making sure every single word landed with absolute crushing clarity. "Do you understand what that actually means under the Uniform Code of Military Justice? By connecting a highly vulnerable corporate network to the naval defense grid, you created a massive, unauthorized security blind spot. You exposed highly classified personnel data and tactical grading matrices to potential foreign interception. You risked the digital infrastructure of the entire United States Navy, just so you could fake a passing grade in basic naval strategy." Naomi took another slow step backward until her shoulders hit the concrete wall. As a seasoned corporate lawyer, she instantly understood the catastrophic legal implications of what I was saying. Her eyes widened as the true scale of the disaster finally dawned on her. "That completely elevates your actions from simple academic dishonesty to federal cyber espionage and treason," I said, delivering the final fatal blow. "You are not going to be quietly dismissed from the candidate program. You are going to be formally charged under federal law and transferred to the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Leavenworth. You are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal military prison, a concrete cell where your trust fund means absolutely nothing." The word Leavenworth hit Jason like a physical strike to the chest. The last remaining shreds of his manufactured confidence evaporated completely. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine, his body trembling so violently that the heavy metal chair began to rattle against the concrete floor. He was a pampered, spoiled heir who had never faced a single consequence in his 30 years of life, and he was suddenly staring down the barrel of 2 decades in federal confinement. Jason looked frantically around the room, desperately searching for a lifeline. He looked at Naomi, but his brilliant lawyer wife actively looked away, refusing to meet his eye. He looked at our mother, who was sobbing uselessly into her hands. Finally, his terrified gaze locked onto our father. In that exact moment, the ultimate family loyalty they always preached about vanished entirely. When faced with the reality of a federal prison cell, the golden child did not hesitate to save his own skin. I did not do it! Jason screamed, his voice cracking wildly as he turned on the man who had enabled his worst behavior his entire life. He twisted his body toward Richard, thrusting his chin aggressively toward our father. I do not even know how to code. I do not know how to bypass a military firewall. It was him. It was Dad. Richard gasped, his face turning a sickening shade of pale green. Jason, shut your mouth right now, Richard hissed, taking a panicked step forward. No, I am not going to take the fall for this, Jason yelled hysterically, entirely abandoning the father who had pampered him. Dad told me not to worry about failing the test. He said his lead systems engineer at the manufacturing plant could set up a proxy server and tunnel into the grading system. His company did all the hacking. They gave me the login portal on my laptop. I just typed in the answers they handed me. It was his idea. The interrogation room fell dead silent once again. The Golden Boy had just confessed to a massive federal conspiracy on a hot microphone, and he had dragged his billionaire father right into the fire with him. Richard stared at his son with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The golden child, the heir apparent to his massive corporate empire, had just crumbled under the very first sign of pressure and dragged his own father directly into the line of fire. You pathetic, weak little coward. Richard spat, his voice trembling with a violent mixture of rage and panic. I gave you absolutely everything. I bought you the best tutors, the most expensive private schools, and the easiest life imaginable. And the second things get difficult. The second you are forced to face a single consequence, you try to throw your own father under the bus. You are an absolute disgrace to this family. Jason just sobbed louder, shrinking away from Richard and burying his face into his shoulder as best he could, with his hands securely cuffed behind his back. Richard whipped his head around to face me. He aggressively smoothed down the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, taking a deep, shuddering breath, as if he could simply brush off the federal conspiracy his son had just laid bare. He forced the rising panic down quickly, replacing it with the cold, calculating arrogance of a corporate chief executive officer who had never lost a boardroom battle in his entire life. Listen to me very carefully, Clara, Richard commanded, dropping his voice into a deep, authoritative register. That boy is terrified and spouting absolute nonsense. But even if there is a digital trail leading back to my corporate servers, it does not matter. It does not matter at all. Do you know why? Because my manufacturing company is currently valued at over $500 million. We are not some disposable local vendor you can just intimidate. We are a foundational pillar of the military-industrial complex. He began pacing the length of the small concrete room, his confidence artificially inflating with every step he took. Naomi watched him carefully from her corner, her sharp legal mind clearly recognizing that Richard was dangerously close to confessing his own involvement just to prove a point. We hold ironclad multi-year government contracts, Richard boasted, loudly waving his hand dismissively at the classified folder on the table. We supply the reinforced titanium components for the newest class of nuclear submarines. We manufacture the advanced navigation casings that your very own ships rely on to operate in hostile waters. Thousands of jobs in 3 different states depend entirely on my company keeping its doors open. The United States Navy needs me. The Pentagon needs me. He stopped pacing and pointed a rigid finger directly at my face. You honestly believe the Department of Defense is going to let you burn down a $500 million supply chain over a rigged multiple-choice test? You think the admirals sitting in the Pentagon are going to halt the production of critical naval warships just because my idiot son borrowed an engineer to hack a grading portal? Grow up, Clara. That is not how the real world works. The military runs on hardware, logistics, and money. I provide all 3. My mother, Patricia, slowly lowered her hands from her tear-stained face, a small, desperate glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. She desperately wanted to believe that Richard's wealth was truly powerful enough to make this entire nightmare disappear. They will bury this, Richard stated with absolute, unwavering certainty. If you try to escalate this to the Judge Advocate General, your superiors will immediately shut you down. They will quietly sweep this under the rug to protect their manufacturing deadlines, and you will just look like a hysterical rogue officer who does not understand the bigger picture. So here is what is going to happen right now. Richard stepped up to the steel table, leaning his knuckles heavily against the metal. You are going to take those classified logs, and you are going to put them through a paper shredder. I will take Jason home, strip him of his allowance, and hide him in a corporate office out of state where he cannot embarrass me anymore. You get to keep your shiny gold stars, and the Navy gets to keep its titanium. That is the only logical conclusion to this ridiculous family drama. I stood perfectly still, letting his massive, arrogant monologue completely fill the sterile interrogation room. I looked at the smug certainty settling back into his features. He truly believed he was untouchable. He honestly thought his corporate wealth made him a god among men, completely immune to the federal laws that governed the rest of the country. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with his flawed assessment of the military supply chain. Instead, I slowly walked around the heavy steel table, my polished black shoes clicking softly against the concrete floor. I stopped when I was standing less than 2 feet away from him. The stark height difference was suddenly amplified by the sheer crushing authority radiating from my perfectly tailored uniform. Richard's smug expression faltered slightly as I invaded his personal space. I leaned in close, locking my eyes onto his with the cold, calculating precision of a predator that had finally backed its prey into an inescapable corner. You really think I whispered, my voice dropping so low and sharp that it sent a visible shiver down his spine, that my primary target today was a cheating cadet? I stepped back from Richard, allowing the silence of my question to settle deeply into his corporate bones. He blinked, his absolute certainty finally breaking against the cold reality of my demeanor. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored uniform jacket and withdrew a small, sleek black remote control. I pointed it toward the ceiling and pressed a single button. The harsh fluorescent lights in the room instantly dimmed to a low hum. A mechanical whirring sound echoed above us as a hidden digital projector descended from a concealed panel in the ceiling. A massive high-definition display illuminated the blank concrete wall directly behind my brother. Richard turned his head, his eyes narrowing at the glowing screen. "What is this?" he demanded, trying to inject his usual authority back into his voice. "Another one of your pathetic tech support presentations." I clicked the remote again, and the first slide appeared. It was an organizational chart of a highly classified federal task force bearing the official seals of the Department of Defense and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Right at the very top of the command structure, printed in bold black letters, was my name. For the past 3 years, I explained you and Mother loved to tell your country club friends that I was just a lowly government IT worker. You told everyone I fixed routers and managed email servers because it made you feel vastly superior. My actual assignment was slightly more complicated. I clicked the small black remote. The screen shifted to a series of highly detailed surveillance photographs and intercepted corporate emails. I was the commanding officer of Operation Deep Current, I continued. It was a joint federal task force specifically designed to investigate and dismantle domestic corruption within the military-industrial complex. We were looking for greedy defense contractors who thought they were smart enough to actively defraud the United States government. My mother let out a small, terrified gasp. Jason stared at the wall, completely forgetting his own handcuffs, as the sheer scale of my operation washed over him. Naomi stood frozen, her eyes tracking every single document flashing on the wall with the terrifying speed of a lawyer realizing her firm was heavily implicated. I clicked the remote a third time. The screen filled with complex metallurgical reports, shipping manifests, and offshore banking ledgers. Right in the center of the display was the unmistakable corporate logo of Richard's manufacturing company. Your firm secured a $500 million federal contract to supply reinforced titanium components for the newest class of nuclear attack submarines, I stated. The Navy trusted you to provide materials capable of withstanding crushing deep-sea pressure. But you decided your profit margins were slightly more important than the lives of American sailors. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but the air seemed to have completely vanished from his lungs. He stared at the offshore bank account numbers glowing on the concrete wall. You systematically falsified the metallurgical testing data, I said, my voice hardening. You utilized a network of international shell companies to purchase substandard counterfeit titanium alloys at a fraction of the cost. You forged the safety certifications, integrated the weak metals into the navigation casings, and pocketed tens of millions of taxpayer dollars. You deliberately compromised the structural integrity of active-duty nuclear submarines to fund your son's vanity projects. That is an absolute lie. Richard suddenly exploded, his voice cracking wildly. That is forged evidence. You manufactured all of this just to get back at me. My company is perfectly clean. My supply chains are secure. Nobody knows about those hidden accounts. He stopped abruptly, realizing what he had just said. He had inadvertently confirmed the existence of the hidden accounts. I am a respected businessman, he stammered, stepping back toward the coffee station, his hands trembling violently. You cannot just project a few fake documents on a wall and expect me to crumble. My chief financial officer would have alerted me immediately if the federal government was auditing our secure ledgers. My phone would have been ringing off the hook. I smiled. It was the same cold, predatory smile that had terrified Naomi just minutes ago. Then why do you not check your phone, Richard? I suggested softly. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight. His hands shook uncontrollably as he reached into his expensive suit pants and pulled out his smartphone. He had silenced it for the commissioning ceremony, completely ignoring the outside world. He pressed his thumb against the screen. The pale light illuminated his face in the dim room. His eyes widened in absolute soul-crushing horror. Sitting clearly on his digital display were 40 missed calls from his chief financial officer, accompanied by a rapid string of frantic, panicked text messages. Richard stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone, his thumb hovering frozen over the glass. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. He did not need to open the voicemail or answer the incoming calls. The frantic capitalized text messages from his chief financial officer painted a perfectly clear picture of the absolute devastation unfolding miles away. His jaw worked silently, his eyes darting back and forth across the screen, as if reading the words multiple times would somehow change their catastrophic meaning. I did not give him the chance to process the shock in silence. I stepped back, crossing my arms over my decorated chest, and delivered the final, fatal assessment of his empire. Exactly 5 minutes ago, I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the sterile interrogation room, while you were pacing around this room, threatening to ruin my military career. Tactical teams from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice breached the main lobby of your corporate headquarters. Richard dropped his phone. It hit the concrete floor with a sharp crack, the glass spider webbing outward, but he did not even look down. He just stared at me, his breathing shallow and rapid. They did not knock. I continued, ensuring every single word landed with maximum impact. They executed a coordinated multi-agency federal raid involving over 60 armed agents. They have already secured the executive floors, physically disconnected your servers, and seized every single hard drive in the building. Your chief financial officer is currently sitting in the back of an armored federal vehicle, and your entire board of directors is being rounded up for questioning by federal prosecutors. Your $500 million company is officially an active crime scene surrounded by yellow tape and federal marshals. My mother let out a strangled, breathless cry. She pressed her back flat against the concrete wall, her hands clutching her expensive designer dress, as if the fabric itself was about to be repossessed. Patricia, who had spent her entire life measuring a person's worth by their bank account and social standing, was suddenly staring into an abyss of absolute poverty. But a federal raid is just the beginning of the protocol, Richard, I said, shifting my gaze back to my father. You are not dealing with a simple corporate audit or a manageable civil fine. The Department of Justice has formally classified your manufacturing company as a criminal enterprise. They have invoked the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The acronym hit the room like a physical shockwave. Naomi, standing quietly in the corner, suddenly gasped, loudly. As a senior partner at a high-powered law firm, she knew exactly what the RICO Act meant. Her sharp, calculating eyes widened in absolute horror as the legal reality of my words washed over her. Under the RICO Act, I explained, keeping my tone completely clinical and devoid of any sympathy. The federal government has the immediate unilateral authority to freeze and seize any assets tied to the criminal enterprise. And because you used your personal and family accounts to launder the stolen government funds, the contamination has spread to absolutely everything you own. I walked slowly back to the steel table, tapping my finger against the classified folder once more. As of this exact moment, every single corporate bank account has been frozen. Your offshore Cayman Islands accounts have been seized through international banking treaties. The deed to your multi-million-dollar mansion is currently being processed for federal forfeiture. Your platinum credit cards will decline. Your stock portfolios are locked. You do not have a single dollar to your name. You are entirely, completely bankrupt. Richard's knees finally buckled. The man who had stood tall and arrogant just moments ago collapsed into the metal chair next to Jason. He buried his face in his trembling hands, a harsh, guttural sob ripping through his chest. The corporate titan was dead. He was nothing but a broken criminal waiting for a prison cell. Jason whimpered from his own chair, his handcuffed arms completely useless. But the money, Jason cried out, his voice practically a pathetic squeak. The trust fund. What about my trust fund? I looked at my brother with absolute disdain. There is no trust fund, Jason. It was funded by stolen taxpayer money. The federal government reclaimed it 10 minutes ago. You are completely broke. In the corner of the room, Naomi's breathing became heavy and erratic. Her perfectly composed corporate attorney persona completely shattered. She looked down at her left hand, her eyes locking onto the massive $50,000 custom diamond ring that she had shoved in my face just an hour ago by my car. That ring, bought with funds unlocked by my parents, suddenly looked like a federal tracking device. It was no longer a symbol of wealth and status. It was a piece of criminal evidence, subject to immediate federal seizure. She had married Jason strictly for his direct access to that massive family wealth. She had tolerated his staggering incompetence and his insufferable arrogance solely because it came with a multi-million-dollar safety net and a life of absolute luxury. Now that net was completely gone. She was legally tied to a penniless, disgraced felon facing 2 decades in a maximum security military prison. Her lavish lifestyle, her country club memberships, and her financial security had just evaporated into thin air. The realization struck her with the devastating force of a freight train. She looked from her diamond ring to her pathetic, sobbing husband, and finally to me. The absolute, undeniable panic in her dark eyes signaled that the next phase of this family's total implosion was about to begin right before my eyes. Naomi did not waste another second mourning her shattered illusions. I watched as her razor-sharp corporate instincts completely overrode whatever pathetic shred of marital loyalty she might have possessed. She straightened her posture, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her tailored blazer. She took a deep, calculating breath, her eyes instantly transforming from terrified to entirely dead and unreadable. She was a survivalist in a sinking ship, and she was about to throw everyone else overboard to save herself. She turned sharply on her stiletto heels, facing my brother, who was still slumped in his chair, sobbing quietly into his handcuffed wrists. Jason, Naomi said, her voice completely devoid of any warmth or affection. Look at me. Jason sniffled slowly, lifting his tear-streaked face to look at his wife. He probably expected words of comfort, a promise that she would assemble a team of legal bulldogs to fight these charges. He clearly did not understand the woman he had married. I am filing for divorce. Naomi announced, her words clipping through the heavy air like a perfectly aimed sniper shot. I will have the papers drafted and couriered to the Federal Detention Center by tomorrow morning. Jason's jaw dropped. He stared at her, completely unable to process this sudden, violent betrayal on top of everything else. Naomi, what are you talking about? He stammered, his voice cracking. You cannot leave me now. I need you. We are a team. We were a team when you had a multi-million-dollar trust fund and a clear path to a prestigious military career. Naomi corrected him coldly, not moving an inch closer to comfort him. We are not a team when you are a confessed federal criminal who just dragged his billionaire father into a massive cyber espionage conspiracy. You lied to me about your exams. You involved me in a family that is currently being dismantled by the Department of Justice under the RICO Act. You are an absolute liability, and I am cutting my losses before your radioactive idiocy completely destroys my professional reputation. My mother let out another loud wail, completely overwhelmed by the rapid disintegration of her family. Naomi, how can you do this? Patricia cried out, stepping away from the wall. You took vows. You are part of this family. Naomi whipped her head around, glaring at my mother with absolute contempt. I married into a highly successful defense contracting dynasty, Patricia. I did not marry into a crime syndicate, and do not try to guilt-trip me with family loyalty. I have watched how you treat Clara. Your family loyalty is entirely conditional on convenience and wealth. Now that the wealth is gone, I have zero obligations to any of you. She turned her attention back to Jason, who was now openly begging, tears streaming down his face. Naomi, please, he pleaded, shifting desperately in his metal chair. You are a lawyer. You can fix this. You know all the loopholes. Just get me out of these handcuffs. Naomi let out a harsh, incredibly cruel laugh. Get you out. Jason, you confessed to federal treason in a room equipped with classified recording devices while sitting directly across from the director of Fleet Cyber Command. There is no loophole for that level of sheer stupidity. I am a corporate attorney, not a miracle worker. She reached into her handbag, her movements crisp and decisive. Furthermore, I am officially invoking the severability clause in our prenuptial agreement. My assets, my law firm partnership, and my personal offshore holdings are legally distinct from your tainted family money. I structured that contract specifically to protect myself from gross negligence and criminal liability on your part. You get absolutely nothing from me. Jason let out a pathetic, wounded noise, completely broken by her utter lack of empathy. But I love you, he whispered weakly. Naomi sneered, looking down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Grow up, Jason. You love the mirror and you love the money. I am not going down with a felon. Do not ever contact me again. She took a deliberate step backward, physically distancing herself from the crying man she had sworn to love just 2 years ago. She turned to look at me, her posture rigid, her eyes calculating her next strategic move. She had successfully severed her emotional ties, but she knew she was still standing in a federal interrogation room. She believed her legal maneuvering had insulated her from the financial fallout, completely unaware that I had been tracking her personal banking history for the last 18 months. She was about to find out that a prenuptial agreement does not protect you from international money laundering charges. Naomi turned her back on her sobbing husband entirely physically, closing the space between herself and the heavy steel table where I stood. The sheer speed of her transformation from a panicking wife to a cutthroat negotiator was almost impressive. She leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands on the cold metal surface. Her dark eyes, which just moments ago had reflected absolute terror at the mention of the RICO Act, were now burning with the cold, calculating fire of a lawyer desperate to strike a plea deal. Clara, let us be reasonable here. Naomi began, dropping her voice into a smooth, conspiratorial tone. She actually attempted a strained, completely artificial smile, as if the vicious insults she had hurled at me in the parking lot had never happened. We are both intelligent professional women. We operate in high-stakes environments. You know as well as I do that federal prosecutors do not want to spend 5 years battling a billionaire's legal team in court. They want a clean, undeniable conviction, and they want it fast. She took a slow breath, adjusting her designer blazer, fully leaning into her corporate attorney persona. I know everything, Naomi whispered, her eyes darting quickly toward Richard, who was still slumped in his chair, completely broken. I am a senior partner. I reviewed the offshore tax structures. I know exactly which dummy corporations your father used to funnel the fraudulent titanium payments. I know the names of the international bankers who approved the transfers, and I know exactly which overseas shell accounts hold the stolen taxpayer money. Richard lifted his head, his face contorted in a mixture of horror and sheer rage. Naomi, shut your mouth, he croaked, his voice raw. You are bound by attorney-client privilege. You cannot testify against me. Naomi did not even bother to look at him. She just scoffed, a short, incredibly dismissive sound. Attorney-client privilege is immediately nullified under the crime-fraud exception, Richard. She shot back effortlessly, demonstrating her absolute mastery of the law. You used my legal advice to actively launder stolen federal funds. You completely voided my ethical obligations the second you lied on those federal naval contracts. I owe you absolutely nothing. She turned her intense focus entirely back to me. I can hand the Department of Justice a completely airtight case on a silver platter, Naomi offered, her voice thick with desperation, disguised as confidence. I will provide every single piece of documentary evidence they need. I will act as their star witness. I will testify against Richard, against Patricia, and against Jason in open federal court. I will completely dismantle this family's defense strategy from the inside out. She paused, leaning slightly closer across the table, ready to name her price. In exchange, Naomi stated firmly, I want full, unconditional federal immunity. I want my name completely removed from the RICO indictments. I want my personal bank accounts instantly unfrozen, and I want a written guarantee from the Judge Advocate General that my law firm partnership will remain entirely untouched by this investigation. You give me a clean slate, Clara and I will give you the heads of the biggest defense contracting fraudsters in naval history. I stood completely still, listening to her entire pitch without interrupting. The room was deathly quiet, save for the pathetic sounds of my brother crying in the corner. I let Naomi lay all her cards on the table. I let her completely incriminate my parents, confirming their guilt on a hot microphone in a federal holding facility. She truly believed she had outsmarted everyone. She honestly thought that by throwing my family into the fire, she could just walk away with her millions and her prestige perfectly intact. I looked at her extended hand resting on the steel table, waiting for me to shake on the deal. I did not move. Instead, I let out a slow, deeply tired sigh. That is a very generous offer, Naomi, I said, my voice dangerously soft. And you are absolutely right about one thing. Federal prosecutors do love a star witness. They love an inside source who can draw a perfect map of the corruption. A triumphant, incredibly smug smile began to form on Naomi's perfectly contoured face. She thought she had won. But there is a fatal flaw in your negotiation strategy. I continued, my tone dropping to a chilling register. You are trying to sell me information I already own. I reached inside the inner breast pocket of my tailored uniform jacket once more. My hand emerged holding a second manila folder, slightly thinner than the first, but stamped with the exact same top-secret federal clearance warnings. Naomi's triumphant smile vanished instantly. Her dark eyes locked onto the folder, a fresh wave of panic suddenly gripping her chest. I placed the folder down onto the cold steel table and slid it slowly across the metal surface until it stopped directly in front of her. Naomi stared at the second folder sitting perfectly still in front of her. The confident, predatory gleam in her eyes vanished completely, replaced by a sudden creeping dread. She did not reach out to open the file. Her hands remained frozen on the edge of the heavy steel table. She knew exactly what kind of documents required that specific level of top-secret federal classification, and she knew that a flag officer did not bluff during an official interrogation. Since you seem suddenly hesitant to review the discovery materials, Naomi, I will gladly walk you through them myself, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. and entirely devoid of emotion. I reached across the table and flipped the heavy cover open. The sharp rustle of the paper sounded like a guillotine dropping in the quiet room. The top document was not a vague summary or a circumstantial email. It was a certified, unredacted wire transfer receipt. It displayed a massive movement of funds, exactly $4.2 million, routed directly from my father's corporate accounts into an offshore holding trust located in the Cayman Islands. Naomi swallowed hard. Her throat made a sharp, clicking sound. You did not just sit in a comfortable boardroom and offer theoretical legal advice, I explained, tapping my index finger directly onto the digital signature line of the document. You were the primary architect of the entire financial structure. When my father realized he was generating too much illicit cash from the counterfeit titanium contracts, he came directly to you. He needed a way to clean the stolen taxpayer money without triggering a massive federal audit. And you were more than happy to oblige. I slid the next document out from the stack for her to see. It was a digital incorporation certificate for a complex shell company. You used your senior position at Harrison and Wright to set up a massive web of dummy corporations. I continued speaking with the clinical precision of a prosecutor nailing a coffin shut. You used your own encrypted legal credentials to deliberately bypass international banking regulations. You personally authorized 74 separate wire transfers over the last 18 months, washing the dirty money through commercial real estate holding companies before depositing it safely back into the family trust fund. The exact same trust fund you proudly bragged about this morning. The one you used to buy that $50,000 diamond ring currently sitting on your finger. Naomi shook her head rapidly, her perfectly styled hair falling messily into her face. That is completely impossible, she whispered, her voice cracking under the crushing, undeniable weight of the physical evidence. I used a highly secure virtual private network. I routed every single transaction through heavily encrypted offshore servers. You cannot possibly trace those digital signatures back to my personal law firm workstation. I smiled again, a cold, merciless expression that offered her absolutely zero comfort. You are a brilliant corporate lawyer, Naomi, but you are a complete amateur when it comes to global cyber warfare. You actually tried to hide your digital footprints from the director of the United States Fleet Cyber Command. My task force cracked your encrypted servers in less than 4 hours. We have your internet protocol logs, your keystroke data, and every single deleted email you thought was permanently erased from the network. The last remaining shred of Naomi's arrogant posture collapsed completely. She stumbled backward, her expensive designer heels scraping harshly against the concrete floor. She bumped heavily into the wall, her chest heaving as she desperately gasped for air. She looked over at her husband Jason, but he just stared back at her with a blank, completely shattered expression. She had just brutally divorced him to save her own skin, and now she was drowning right next to him in the exact same federal sinking ship. You are not going to be a star witness for the prosecution, Naomi, I stated, delivering the absolute unfiltered reality of her situation. The Department of Justice does not grant blanket immunity to the mastermind of an international money laundering syndicate. You are a primary federal target. You are going to face the exact same judge as my father, and you are going to serve a very long sentence in a federal penitentiary. Your precious law license is permanently gone. Naomi raised her trembling hands, pressing them aggressively against her temples as if she could physically squeeze the nightmare out of her brain. I have to make a phone call, she panicked, her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. I need to call the senior managing partner at my firm right now. I need to warn them about this. I need to secure my private office. You do not need to call anyone, I replied smoothly, picking up my foam coffee cup and taking a slow, incredibly calm sip. Naomi froze instantly, her dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute, unadulterated terror. Your senior managing partner is currently standing in the hallway outside your corner office, I informed her, letting the final piece of the trap snap entirely shut. And he is not alone. A tactical team of federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division walked into your prestigious law firm exactly 20 minutes ago. They are currently boxing up your entire office, seizing your encrypted computers, and waiting patiently by your mahogany desk to arrest you for international money laundering and federal conspiracy the second you walk out of this military base. Naomi's mind simply could not process the absolute finality of the trap that had just snapped shut around her. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life meticulously controlling every single narrative, the sudden realization that federal agents were currently boxing up her prestigious career was too much to bear. The pristine, untouchable corporate lawyer persona did not just crack, it completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her breathing hitched, transforming into a series of sharp, panicked gasps. She stared at me, her dark eyes entirely dilated with a feral, unadulterated panic. She had no legal motions left to file. She had no loopholes to exploit. She was backed into a corner with absolutely nowhere to run, and the primal instinct to fight took complete control of her rational brain. With a sudden guttural scream that echoed violently off the sterile concrete walls, Naomi launched herself forward. She threw her entire body weight across the heavy steel table, her manicured hands outstretched like claws, aiming directly for my face. She swept her arms wildly, knocking the classified manila folders into the air and sending the heavily redacted federal documents scattering across the floor. She shrieked a string of furious, incoherent obscenities, completely abandoning decades of high society etiquette. She wanted to physically tear the smug satisfaction right off my face. She wanted to hurt the person who had just systematically dismantled her entire life. I did not take a single step back. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I simply held on to my foam coffee cup and watched her fly across the table, knowing perfectly well that she would never reach me. The military police officers standing guard inside the interrogation room reacted with terrifying, instantaneous precision. They did not shout warnings. They did not try to de-escalate the situation with words. Before Naomi's fingertips could even brush the fabric of my uniform, two heavily armed master-at-arms personnel stepped forward and intercepted her midair. The lead officer grabbed Naomi by her shoulders, twisting her torso violently to the side and driving her straight down toward the ground. The impact was brutal. Naomi hit the solid concrete floor with a heavy, sickening thud, the breath exploding forcefully from her lungs. Her expensive stiletto heels clattered uselessly against the gray tile. Before she could even attempt to catch her breath or struggle, the second officer dropped his knee heavily between her shoulder blades, pinning her flat against the cold floor. The sharp, unmistakable sound of thick plastic zip ties ratcheting tightly around her wrists filled the room. In less than 4 seconds, the senior partner of a prestigious corporate law firm was immobilized on the ground, breathing heavily through her teeth, her hands securely bound behind her back, like a common street criminal. "Remain absolutely still." The lead officer barked, his hand resting casually on his holstered sidearm as he stared down at her. "If you attempt to assault a flag officer again, the consequences will be significantly more severe." In the corner of the room, Jason let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail. He squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away from the violent scene unfolding right in front of him. The golden child, the man who was supposed to be commissioned as a naval officer this very morning, was completely paralyzed by fear. He huddled in his metal chair, crying loudly into his own handcuffed wrists, entirely useless to his wife and his family. He was a perfect reflection of the hollow, cowardly foundation our parents had built their entire empire upon. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by Jason's muffled sobbing and Naomi's ragged breathing from the floor. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, my eyes drifting smoothly from the neutralized lawyer to my parents. Richard and Patricia were standing completely frozen near the door. The color had entirely drained from their faces. They had just watched their final line of defense get physically tackled and zip-tied by federal guards. The realization finally struck them with the devastating force of a physical blow. Their massive corporate wealth was entirely frozen. Their brilliant legal representation was lying face down on the concrete heading to federal prison. Their perfect son was a confessed traitor. They looked around the sterile interrogation room, the stark reality of their total isolation setting in. They had absolutely no allies left. They had no one to bribe, no one to threaten, and no one to manipulate. Every single tool of power they had ever wielded had been systematically stripped away in a matter of minutes. As the crushing weight of their inescapable reality bore down on them, my parents exchanged a long, desperate look. They silently agreed to abandon their corporate arrogance. If money and threats could no longer save them, they had to rely on the only weapon they had successfully used to control me for 34 years. They were going to weaponize the very concept of family guilt. The heavy silence in the interrogation room was suddenly shattered by the sharp sound of bone hitting concrete. Patricia, the wealthy matriarch, who had spent her entire adult life looking down on everyone from the balcony of her country club, had deliberately thrown herself to the floor. She dropped straight to her knees right in front of the heavy steel table. Her expensive designer skirt bunched up around her legs, but she did not care about her appearance anymore. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, her face completely twisted in an expression of sheer theatrical agony. "Clara, please," Patricia wailed, her voice cracking with a desperate, hysterical edge. "Look at what you are doing. Look at your family." I did not move. I just watched her perform the most pathetic, manipulative act of her entire life. "We are your blood." "Clara!" My mother sobbed, tears streaming freely down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "I carried you in my womb for 9 months. I gave birth to you. We raised you under our roof. You cannot do this to us. You cannot just lock your own flesh and blood in a cage over a little bit of money. It is just government money. It does not even matter in the grand scheme of things. The military has billions. They will not even miss it. But we are your family. Blood is thicker than water." She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers desperately grasping at the empty air between us, as if she could physically pull my sympathy out of the freezing room. "How can you be so incredibly cold?" Patricia cried out, her voice rising to a shrill, accusing pitch. "How can you be so utterly heartless? You are standing there in that pristine white uniform, acting like a perfect saint. But you are a monster. You are a cold, vindictive monster, destroying your own parents and your own brother just to prove a point. We gave you life. You owe us. You owe us your loyalty. You owe us your protection." She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking violently as she continued to weep on the cold gray tile. Richard stood right behind her, offering absolutely no comfort to his wife, but silently hoping her emotional manipulation would somehow crack my federal authority. He was too proud to beg, so he was perfectly willing to let his wife grovel in the dirt to save his corporate empire. I stood absolutely still, listening to her weaponize the very concept of family. She was actually trying to minimize a multi-million-dollar federal treason case into a petty misunderstanding over a little bit of money. She was trying to use the biological fact of my birth as a shield against decades in a federal penitentiary. For 34 years, I had swallowed my anger. I had absorbed their insults, their neglect, and their blatant favoritism without ever raising my voice. Even today, I had maintained the absolute rigid professionalism required of my rank. I had been the cold, calculating director of Fleet Cyber Command, executing a flawless tactical operation. But as I looked down at the woman who had routinely treated me like a worthless mistake, something fundamental shifted inside my chest. The heavy iron vault where I kept my suppressed rage finally cracked wide open. I slowly reached out and placed my foam coffee cup onto the steel table. I did not set it down gently. I slammed it down with such sudden explosive force that the dark liquid splashed over the brim and splattered across the classified folders. The loud, violent crack of the cup hitting the metal made both of my parents jump in terror. Naomi flinched violently from her position on the floor. Jason completely stopped crying, holding his breath in the corner. I stepped around the heavy table, completely invading my mother's space. I looked down at her kneeling form. I was no longer just the federal officer reading a list of charges. I was the scapegoat who had finally acquired enough power to burn the entire pasture to the ground. My professional demeanor vanished entirely. My posture remained perfectly rigid, but the cold, clinical deadpan of my voice was instantly replaced by a deep, vibrating fury. "Do not ever use the word blood with me again," I commanded, my voice echoing off the walls with a terrifying, absolute dominance. Patricia gasped, shrinking back on her knees as the sheer force of my anger washed over her. She looked up at me, her fake tears suddenly drying up, replaced by a genuine paralyzing fear. "You want to talk about being heartless?" I asked, my voice rising, filling every single corner of the sterile interrogation room. "You want to talk about loyalty and what I supposedly owe this family? Get up, Patricia. Get up off the floor and look me in the eye while I tell you exactly what your precious bloodline actually means to me." Patricia scrambled to her feet, her expensive designer dress completely ruined, her hands shaking violently. She looked at me not as her child, but as an executioner. Richard stepped forward, instinctively trying to shield his wife, but I shot him a glare so venomous it froze him entirely in his tracks. He knew better than to interrupt me now. The floor belonged entirely to me. "You want to preach to me about the sacred bond of family," I said, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. "Let us examine the actual, undeniable track record of your maternal love. Let us go back 16 years to the exact week of my 18th birthday. Grandpa Theodore had left me a dedicated college trust fund. It was the only financial security I had to escape this toxic household, to attend a university, and to finally build an independent future. But when I went to the bank to pay my freshman tuition, the account was completely empty. Zero balances across the board. My parents both flinched. They had buried that secret so deeply, they thought it was permanently erased from the historical record. "You did not just withdraw the money," I continued, taking a slow, predatory step closer to them. "You actively forged my legal signature on federal banking documents. You committed financial fraud to drain every single cent of my inheritance so you could buy Jason a $90,000 European sports car as a high school graduation present. You bought your golden child a luxury toy using the exact money meant to secure my education. And when I confronted you about the felony forgery, what did you do? You did not apologize. You did not offer to pay it back. You packed my belongings into black plastic garbage bags and threw me out onto the street in the middle of a pouring rainstorm." Jason whimpered from his chair, suddenly remembering the expensive sports car he had completely totaled just 6 months later by driving it into a ditch. "You left an 18-year-old girl to face absolute homelessness." I stated, my voice completely devoid of any self-pity, fueled entirely by the cold, hard facts of my survival. I slept in bus stations. I worked 3 brutal minimum wage shifts just to afford basic food. I was completely abandoned by the people who are supposedly bound to me by blood. You threw me away like garbage because I refused to be a quiet, compliant prop in your perfect corporate family portrait. Patricia was trembling so hard she had to lean against the heavy steel table just to remain standing. I did not give her a single second to formulate a pathetic excuse or shed another fake tear. "But your ultimate betrayal was the greatest gift you could have ever given me," I told her, my tone dropping to a lethal, vibrating register. "Because when I had absolutely nothing, the United States Navy took me in. They did not care about my last name, my bank account, or my corporate connections. They demanded absolute discipline, unbreakable integrity, and raw intelligence. They gave me an education. They gave me a purpose. And most importantly, they gave me a real family." I pointed firmly to the heavy gold stars on my uniform shoulders. "The men and women who wear this uniform are my blood. The sailors who trusted me to build the defense grid that protects their lives are my family. We bleed for each other. We protect each other. We do not forge signatures, we do not steal from our own, and we absolutely do not sell out our country for a slightly larger profit margin on counterfeit submarine parts." My mother let out a small, broken sob. She finally understood that her emotional manipulation was completely useless. I was not the scared teenager she had kicked out of the house. I was a titanium fortress, and she had provided the very fire that hardened my steel. "You thought you were destroying me when you kicked me out," I said, stepping so close to Patricia that she had to look directly up into my eyes. "You thought I would just disappear into the cracks of society and fade away quietly. You completely underestimated my resilience, my drive, and my intelligence. You stripped away my safety net, forcing me to become completely self-reliant. You taught me how to spot a liar, how to dismantle a manipulator, and how to survive in a world filled with toxic narcissists. You taught me how to be absolutely ruthless when the situation demands it." I stared down at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, unshakable sense of victory. "You did not raise a daughter, Patricia Weiss," whispered my words cutting through the sterile interrogation room with absolute terrifying finality. "You forged a weapon, and today, you are on the wrong side of the barrel." I did not wait for my mother to formulate a response to that absolute truth. I simply turned my back on the weeping woman on the floor, the broken corporate executive, the disgraced naval candidate, and the handcuffed lawyer. I walked to the heavy steel door and knocked twice. The military police opened it immediately, stepping inside to officially begin processing the federal detainees. I walked out of the sterile interrogation room, leaving my toxic family behind in the cold, windowless box they had built for themselves. The fallout was incredibly swift, brutal, and thoroughly documented by every major news outlet in the country. The military justice system does not tolerate espionage, and they certainly do not tolerate entitled candidates attempting to hack their secure networks. Jason faced a highly publicized court-martial. Without our father's corporate wealth to hire a team of elite defense attorneys, my brother was assigned a standard military public defender. He cried through the entire proceeding, desperately trying to blame his father on the witness stand, but the judge was entirely unmoved by his pathetic deflections. He was officially stripped of his candidate status, dishonorably discharged, before he ever even received a rank, and sentenced to 5 years of hard time at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Leavenworth. There are no silk sheets or catered meals in military prison. He is currently learning how to scrub concrete floors, completely stripped of his arrogant swagger and his imaginary trust fund. My parents faced an even more catastrophic reality. The Department of Justice brought the full crushing weight of the RICO Act down upon Richard's manufacturing empire. Richard desperately tried to call his powerful friends in the Senate and the Pentagon, but the moment the words cyber espionage and counterfeit submarine parts hit the press, every single politician and military official immediately severed all ties with him. He became entirely radioactive. During the federal trial, the financial forensics provided by my Cyber Command task force were so overwhelmingly damning that a jury convicted both of my parents in less than 4 hours. Richard collapsed at the defense table when the verdict was read. Richard and Patricia were sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and treason. The federal forfeiture laws stripped them of absolutely everything. I watched on the local news as federal marshals placed heavy padlocks on the wrought iron gates of their sprawling multi-million-dollar estate. The luxury cars were auctioned off. The offshore accounts were completely drained and repatriated to the government. Patricia, who had spent her entire existence defining her worth by her designer wardrobe and her exclusive country club memberships, was forced to trade her tailored silk dresses for a standard-issue orange federal jumpsuit. She is currently serving her time in a minimum security facility, completely isolated from the high society friends who abandoned her the exact second her bank accounts were frozen. Naomi's downfall was perhaps the most poetic of them all. The brilliant, cutthroat corporate lawyer who thought she could outsmart the federal government was completely thrown to the wolves by her own prestigious law firm. The senior partners immediately fully cooperated with the FBI, handing over all of Naomi's internal emails and encrypted files to secure their own immunity. She was subjected to a highly humiliating disciplinary hearing, where she was permanently disbarred and stripped of her license to practice law anywhere in the United States. The judge presiding over her criminal trial showed absolutely zero leniency to an officer of the court who had actively engineered an international money laundering syndicate. She was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. That massive $50,000 diamond ring she loved to wave in my face was seized as criminal evidence and auctioned off by the state to restitute the stolen taxpayer funds. The legal battles took months to fully conclude, generating thousands of pages of court transcripts and endless hours of national media coverage. But I did not attend a single one of their sentencing hearings. I had already delivered my verdict in that interrogation room, and I felt absolutely no need to gloat over their physical incarceration. The toxic roots that had suffocated my childhood had been completely pulled from the ground and incinerated by the justice system. The debt was finally paid in full. The long, exhausting war against my own bloodline was over. The intense media scrutiny surrounding the scandal eventually faded away, replaced by the next breaking news cycle, leaving me with something I had not experienced in 34 years. Absolute, uninterrupted peace. I walked down the long, echoing corridor of the Tactical Administration Building. With every step my polished black shoes took against the linoleum floor, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lifting entirely off my shoulders. The frantic screaming of my father, the pathetic crying of my brother, and the desperate, manipulative sobbing of my mother faded into a distant, muted hum behind the heavy steel doors. For my entire life, I had carried the invisible, crushing burden of my family's expectations. I had worn their conditional love and their relentless disappointment like a heavy iron chain around my neck. But now that chain was completely shattered. I did not look back over my shoulder. There was absolutely nothing left for me in that interrogation room but ghosts and convicted criminals. I reached the end of the sterile hallway and placed both hands on the heavy double doors leading to the outside world. I pushed them open and stepped out into the blazing Virginia sunlight. The physical transition was breathtaking. The harsh artificial fluorescent lights of the federal holding facility were instantly replaced by the brilliant golden warmth of the morning sun. The salty, crisp ocean breeze swept forcefully across the waterfront, filling my lungs with the clean, undeniable air of absolute freedom. I stood at the top of the concrete steps, taking a moment to simply breathe and look out over the massive expanse of Naval Station Norfolk. The towering gray steel hulls of the aircraft carriers and guided missile destroyers sat docked proudly in the deep blue harbor. They were unmovable, unbreakable fortresses of strength, perfectly reflecting the exact same resilience I had finally recognized within myself. I took a deep breath, adjusting the lapels of my crisp white uniform, and began to walk down the steps. I did not get far before I realized I was not alone. Waiting for me at the bottom of the staircase was Admiral Kensington. He had not returned to the ceremonial pavilion to mingle with the politicians. Instead, he had gathered a formidable line of high-ranking naval officers, department heads, and tactical commanders from my cyber task force. They were standing in perfect, rigid formation, their white uniforms gleaming in the sunlight. As my foot touched the bottom step, Admiral Kensington snapped to absolute attention. The entire line of officers moved in flawless synchronization, raising their right hands in a crisp, razor-sharp salute. This was not a standard military protocol rendered simply because of the gold stars on my shoulder boards. I could see the profound truth in Admiral Kensington's eyes, and in the resolute, respectful expressions of the men and women standing beside him. They knew exactly what had just transpired in that holding facility. They knew the agonizing, unprecedented choice I had been forced to make to protect the defense grid. This salute was a silent, powerful acknowledgement of absolute integrity. It was a gesture of supreme respect for an officer who had chosen duty, honor, and the safety of her country over the corrupt, selfish demands of her own bloodline. These were the people who actually had my back. This was my true family. I raised my right hand and returned the salute with perfect military precision. I held it there for a long moment, acknowledging their respect and locking away the trauma of my past forever. As I lowered my arm, dropping my hand to my side, a genuine, radiant smile broke across my face. For the first time in 34 years, I felt no anxiety, no need to prove my worth, and no lingering shadow of childhood rejection. I was truly, completely free. I turned my gaze away from the harbor, now looking directly at you. The women watching this who know exactly what it feels like to be the designated scapegoat in a toxic family dynamic. They will constantly tell you that you owe them your loyalty just because you share a bloodline. They will try to convince you that family is an unbreakable contract, even when that family actively breaks your spirit, sabotages your success, and demands your silent submission to keep their perfect image intact. Do not believe their lies. True loyalty is never an entitlement. True loyalty is earned through mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine love. When a tree is rotten to its very core, you cannot save it by continuously watering the dead branches. Toxic roots need to be cut so that you can finally grow into the person you were always meant to be. If you are the black sheep who walked away from the manipulation, if you are the woman who survived the emotional neglect and built your own empire from the ground up, leave a comment below. Share your victory with us. Subscribe to hear more stories of taking back your power setting, unbreakable boundaries, and demanding the justice you deserve. Your life belongs entirely to you. Never let anyone make you apologize for protecting your peace. The story of Clara dismantles the age-old societal myth that blood is thicker than water. Society often pressures us to endlessly forgive and endure emotional abuse from toxic family members simply because we share the same DNA. However, Clara's journey reveals a profound and liberating truth. Biological ties do not excuse psychological torment, nor do they entitle anyone to your unconditional loyalty. For decades, Clara's parents and brother used the concept of family as a weapon to manipulate, belittle, and exploit her. They demanded her silent submission to maintain their hollow, narcissistic facade. But Clara's ultimate victory did not just stem from her high-ranking military status. It blossomed from her realization that her true family consisted of the people who respected her integrity and nurtured her growth. She recognized that her toxic roots had to be decisively severed in order for her to truly thrive. We often feel immense guilt for walking away from destructive relatives, fearing we are somehow abandoning our moral duties. Yet, as this narrative powerfully illustrates, true loyalty must be earned through consistent respect and care. When the people who are supposed to protect you become your greatest source of pain, choosing to walk away is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of profound self-preservation. Clara's stoic resilience teaches us that we do not have to accept the demeaning roles handed to us by those who wish to keep us small. We possess the absolute power to define our own worth, build our own empires, and choose our own families based on mutual respect rather than empty obligation. If you have ever had to cut toxic family ties to protect your peace, share your journey in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of empowerment.